So I'm using Judy Thompson's book, Women's Work, Women's Art, for some of the pattern making ideas. I've gone to different museums, and the museum here in Anchorage has some objects, some tunics, but it's also helpful us to see someone else translating a three-dimensional object to two-dimensional representation. And so I've gone back and forth between looking at a three-dimensional object, Judy Thompson's book, and then sketching it out on fabric. One of the things that we've talked a little bit about is historically or traditionally, the garments that I'm working on would be made out of caribou skin. So today on the Kenai Peninsula where I live, it's not really feasible or realistic to make garment-sized objects out of caribou because it's a lottery. You might get a caribou tag, you might not, and then you might get a caribou and you might not. So in order to keep this tradition alive, the moose is a way of doing that because you just can't get caribou like you used to be able to. The sewing techniques and all the skin working methods are nearly the same for working between moose and caribou. It's just that moose is much larger. So the amount of work that goes into tanning a moose hide compared to even tanning like 2 or 3 or 4 caribou skins is a lot more because it's just the thickness and the size. In order to not waste any hide, I like to make a pattern first, and I'm gonna make a pattern for like a tunic or a shirt. And so I'm starting with the body pieces. So I cut a piece of, I put the fabric out and then kind of put my shoulders to the fabric, making sure it's wide enough to go all the way to the edges, which is also gonna be wide enough to get over my hips. And that's how I measured the width of the fabric, and now I'm kind of playing with the collar and going around the shoulder to where leather doesn't stretch at all. So you need to have enough space to actually move your arm all the way up. Otherwise, you're just gonna get stuck if you don't have enough fabric. So that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm just kind of doing a little bit of biometric measuring and then seeing how this fits when it drapes on me. Looks more or less right. And then what I'll be able to do is once I get the pattern correct, then I can lay it out on the hide and kind of judge and see like, okay, well I have some holes here, so if I line up the edge of my material with those holes, that might be a good way to do it. There's some holes here, but I might just do a patch in that spot. So it's finding where I want my patches to be.
Are you also considering the different thicknesses of this piece of hide?
Yeah, so like this right now is spanning the middle of the hide, which is pretty thick, and this is kind of hard, so I wouldn't actually put this right here. I was more thinking of doing it along the bottom of like the belly over here, because this hole, especially right here, this is really flexible and there's not really any holes right here. So if I was thinking about, I could do a piece here. So just kind of finding, like might put that there and then fold this piece here. And then I still have quite a bit of hide to make many other things, and like the sleeves. So I've cut the front piece and the back piece of my pattern, and I have this kind of just paper clipped in place because I'm just kind of adjusting things. I've been working at just folding it over to create symmetry, so I'll measure out one side, get it to fit, then fold the pattern over, cut it. And I have kind of fit it just on my body with like clipping it to me, so now I'm just doing a really wide kind of basting stitch to put it together so I can try it on and make sure I can get my head into it. And then if I can't, then I'll widen the collar and get that to where my head. The other thing that's important is to make sure my arms can move. Whenever I'm making garments, because I'm not a tailor by trade, I'm a sculptor, I usually do a version in fabric, sew it all the way together, try it on, and then I take that apart and make it in the material that I want to use. Because usually I'm working with animal skin and silk, and those aren't cheap materials, so I want to make sure that I do it right the first time. Okay, so I tried it on and my head fits over it. Then the other thing I did is I made sure I could sit down in it. So now I'm going to sew up the sides to test for my armpit and shoulder, making sure that it can rotate. And I feel like right now, like this is where this needs to join, and that's a little bit too tight. So I might sew it a little bit loose right here just to start with, so I have a little bit of extra, and then open up the shoulder a little bit more. On this side, Sandra and I talked yesterday a little bit about adding like a dart or a piece into the armpit. So I kind of just eyeballed what looked good and kind of looking at what we saw at the the object that's in the collection on display behind glass, and I was like, oh, that's about 2 inches wide. And then sewed it in and then tried the arm, and I could move, and it wasn't quite so binding. And then I measured the sleeve, and I just put some string around the opening of the arm to make sure it would fit. Actually, it was this piece here. So I paper clipped the string to it and then cut that, so I knew that I had the right dimension there. And then I took another piece of thread and then just did it around my palm of my hand, kind of making a fist to make sure I could like get my hand through it, and then used that for this distance. And then I took a piece of thread, and I knew the seam was about my shoulder, and then brought it down to the end of my arm, and then used that for the length.
I just wanted to make sure you had enough material, but it looks like you did for the welt too. When you sew up, it's going to get shorter.
In the welt's that piece of material that goes between the 2 pieces of fabric, or the 2 pieces of leather. It'd be like putting a piece in here and then going like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then doing the stitch around.
That helps it keep it strong, and so that it doesn't pull out.
I may need to trim.
Yeah,
There's
just
looks
trim.
like a little bit of extra at the sleeve, so open up that seam and cut it.
Yeah, what I would do too is I would not sew this up first. I would sew this.
Okay.
Then you'd have this to go all the way down. Then you can cut off whatever you need.
What I'll do is I'll cut this back open when I get sewing to this corner, and there's always going to be like a bunch of material where the armpit happens, and it can be better to curve that a little bit.
So if you are able to bind it up together like that and cut that piece off, see that? See, and then you probably have enough right there just to do it, right?
Then that fits the curve of the arm. This is really thick cotton fabric, and it mimics the leather, so you can see how it drapes better.
But if you don't have it, you can use a sheet.
Yep.
Get an old sheet and just use that.
Here is where the armpit is, and wanting to make sure that that's the spot that is nice and rounded as it comes together. So it fits, I can do this and it moves better than before, because before when I did this, the whole part came up with it. So we added like extra triangles there. Yeah, so it's ready to be taken apart, and then we'll lay it out on the hide and be able to see which pieces need to be where, and then we can start cutting. So I'm ready for the pattern to come apart, and I'm going to label all the pattern pieces so I know which ones go together. D, the left side. When I was sewing, I didn't use strong seams so that I could either just rip it or use the scissors and very easily take it apart. I've laid out all the pieces of fabric, and I've felt the hide to feel where the most flexible pieces are, and I try and have the more flexible, thinner parts come together at the seams at the top of the body, and especially the arms, so there's less bulk. So all these edges up here where the top of the sleeve are really flexible. And then finding places like these little triangle pieces, finding spots that are flexible, which is towards the belly section. And then the other thing is this piece here has these small sections there, and I just folded those under for placing it on the hide, because this creates a section of kind of waste material, and this is a piece that needs to be flexible to drape over the shoulder. So I patched those together with a couple spots by the belly, which are more flexible. I either use the loose niche, the scissors, or I'll use a razor to cut the hide with. And it's nice to have sharp scissors that are a little bit stouter, which these are not, but they'll still work. I did all the drawing on the inside of the garment, which is going to be the non-smoke side of the hide. When I was placing it, I tried to line up to where I'm having minimal amounts of waste material. And when tracing out the pattern, you want to make sure the hide is as smooth and flat as possible. Otherwise, your seams won't be straight. So when you're sewing, the thread length that I tell people or like to do is like a wingspan, where I take my arm and I go with my other hand to like the middle of my body, or I sometimes go all the way up to my other shoulder but not past that. And what that does is it allows your thread to not get tangled. If you take out too much thread, you can't pull tension, because you can only pull the length of holding your piece and your extension of your arm. So if you go longer than that, then you have to like choke up and pull, and then you have all this tail that gets all tangled, and so it's just a mess. What I'm sewing with for the patches and doing this tunic today is artificial sinew. And the reason why is there's so much area patching the holes that I'm doing that it takes a lot of time to make all the real sinew. And it's actually 4 pieces of about 5,000 yard long monofilament. So it's just a plastic thread that splits apart into 4 smaller pieces of thread. And you'll get, like, that looks like it's a big mess, and yes, in fact it is, but the great thing is that they're not twisted and it's waxed. So all I have to do is do my fingers, and now this is all nice and straight. So I have 4 pieces of thread that come off of this. And then there actually might be a 5th one. There's 5. So there's a 5th one. So there, for every what looks like one big piece of thread, there's actually 5 small pieces of artificial sinew. You can buy artificial sinew that's round, that isn't like this, and you can buy some come in 4, some come in 6. This one came in 5. There's different colors, and then you just pull it apart. And now I have my piece of thread. The next stage is patch the holes before sewing up the side pieces, and sometimes around the openings they're a little bit crunchy, and so just taking the rock and kind of smoothing out or softening up the edges around that. I've decided I'm going to patch this hole, and what I'm doing is I'm finding a piece of material that looks pretty similar to what the color around here is, and this has a nice mottled surface, and I'm going to just test to see what the color looks like underneath. And I think that's close enough. I'm happy with that, because the color matching helps kind of disguise the hole. And so I put it face up underneath to look and see what the color looks like, and then I kind of line it up and make sure, like, okay, that's my edges, because I'm not wanting to waste any material, and I'm still happy with that. And so in order to not make the surface have any lead mark or graphite mark on it with the pencil, I'm just going to flip it over and then make sure I have enough of a seam allowance with the hole that I need to scoot it over a little bit like that. And then I kind of hold tension with a few spots of my fingers, and then I just trace the hole a little bit. And you want to make sure that you clean up with scissors or a knife around the edge before you make your patch, because if I thought, oh no, I need to come in here, I'd have a big divot and I wouldn't have a big enough patch. So it's important to clean up your parent material's edge before you make a patch. So now I've traced my circle, and then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut, and I'm going to leave like just a little bit, like maybe 1/8 of an inch of border around the patch. I'd rather make the patch a little bit too big right now than too small, because when I sew on the patch, I usually end up trimming a little bit to match. What was once this side is now this side. So it's good to have your holes that you're patching be symmetrical so that you can trace it and then flip over your patch and it doesn't matter. I just like to check to make sure that it fits, and that does. You don't want it too bulky or it doesn't lay smooth and flat. So that is like perfect, where it almost wants to come through, but it's not. I'm using a #1 size Clover sewing needle, which is a very large needle. I have a dipped rubberized glove that acts like a needle pull on each finger, and then I also have my thimble. And I usually like to tie on to the patch, and I just tie a knot to the leather. And it's just 2 square knots, and I pull it nice and tug on both sides and kind of move it around to make sure it's locked into place. When you're sewing leather, you can't just make a knot and then pull against the knot as a stop. You actually need to tie off your thread, because the knot will work its way through the leather in a way that's different than fabric. And I usually will sew the back, the reverse side of what I'm patching. You want to make sure that the tail is on the reverse side so it doesn't get visible on the front of your piece of material that you're trying to patch. And then I will come through here and then come through the patch material. And I'm doing a whip stitch. And what my needle was doing is I'm trying to just come on the inside of the parent material, the hole, and then I'm trying to almost hit where the graphite mark was before, and that makes sure that I'm catching enough material of the patch, but I'm not going too deep on the patch side. I've just done 2 stitches, and I noticed that like, oh, there's a little bit too much extra over here, and so I'm gonna rotate, I'm gonna pull this a little bit to the side like that, and then I'm pinching it with my thumb and my forefinger, and then I'm gonna tighten that up, because there's just some movement still. So you wanna check as you go when you're doing patches and just be thinking good thoughts, being in a good headspace and taking your time so you don't rush it and ruin it. So I'm almost finished sewing the patch, and what I like to do is make sure it's flat and there's not any rippling that's happening or puckering, and then I'll flip the patch over to the other side and kind of push on it to make sure it lays flat, and look at it from this side and make sure it's flat and smooth. And it is. There's almost a slight one here, but that's more of just a knob, so I'm okay with that. And you should be able, you'll see a couple of little stitches, but it shouldn't be like big glaring pieces of thread coming through. So I'm going to do one more stitch, and this will be the stitch that I tie the knot with. And it's just a square knot off to the material. And instead of pulling the loop all the way through, I'll tighten the previous stitch and get it kind of close, and then do a square knot. So I just bring the thread up through, and then I really pull on that. And I like to leave the little pigtail on the other side so I can tie a knot. I can tie them together. And I just tie the 2 ends together, and then I'll go back when I go to finish the garment, and I'll lightly melt those threads together. So that is tight, and then I'll just cut extra right now. And by cutting that extra, like it's almost an inch, if that knot comes loose, when I go back through to melt it, I'll know if it did, and then I'll be able to really pull it down, trim it, and burn it, and then it'll be locked into place. Instead of trimming it closely and come back and burn it later, that knot might have opened up and I won't have anything to hang on to tie it. And then once the patch is finished, I like to just work, I push with my fingers from the back and pull, kind of overexpose the stitches, and then I massage it back down. And then it tends to lay flatter that way. So one of the things about needles that we're sewing with are they're skin sewing needles, so they're basically a knife on the end. And just like knives in your kitchen that you might want to sharpen when they get dull, needles get dull. What you can do is the same thing like with a knife, or if you have like flat sharpening grinding stones, you can do the same thing. So you can take it to a stone and you can just drag, there's 3 sides to these needles, and you can drag the needle and just rotate it. It's basically a pyramid on its side. I'm just making sure I get the angle right. So I'm looking to match the angle of the needle with the stone. And now I could test on this piece of leather, and it can go through now. Yesterday I sewed the front half and the back half together, and in order to piece the back half, I decided that I would make this shoulder piece separate and use a thinner part of the hide that was really flexible to where it drapes nicely over the shoulder. And each time there's a seam, I use a welt, which is just a thin piece of hide that's been cut. The seam incorporates 3 pieces of material. You have your 2 parent pieces of leather in this case, and then you have your welt strip. So if I were to join these 2 pieces of material, I would layer these like that. Once you've sewed all your pieces together, you unfold them like you would a notebook, spiral bound notebook, and you kind of work them to where they're flat. And what that does is it creates a smooth part on the inside of the garment, which is going to be touching your body, and then you have a ridge on the outside. And that welt reinforces the seam without adding bulk to the inside of the garment. So to start the welt here, I tied, you can see a long tail. I tied the thread to the leather and then started doing my whip stitch all the way through, and then tied off on the other side. Usually when I'm working on a full garment, I don't burn or snip my tails until I'm done, and I go through and I clean up the whole thing at the end. And what that allows for is, like, let's say, like, oops, I need to add something on here. I have another piece of thread right here, and if I start something else, I can tie those two ends together, and it's more secure. So what I'm trying to do for the welt is you want to find a piece that's thin and flexible, so that it can move with the seam well. If you take something that's thick like this, that's like a 1/4 inch or thicker, and add that to a seam, you're just bulking up your seam too much. And this is pretty rigid. This is more, like we talked about yesterday, for boots. So I'm looking at my thin pieces, and ideally I would have a piece that runs the whole length to where I don't have to do two together. And then I'm gonna trim off. We've already trimmed the whole edge of the hide when we were down in Kenai. So I'm just cutting this about a 1/4 inch thick. And on a lot of commercial hides, this really, really thin leather isn't included in the hide that you buy. You have to buy separate, like, quarters, or they sell cord that's already been cut for you. All right, so there's the welt strip. So this is going to join up with the shoulder piece. So if we think about sewing it, we would go outside, welt, and then we want the outside piece to create a sandwich where you have your two outsides together. So I would lay this on top here. So I've lined up my two, there's my smoked side of the hide and my smoked side of the hide and my welt all together. I made a little sandwich, and then I'm going to use paper clips to just hold it in place. So what that allows me to do is now I can bend this, and I can pick it up and I can move it around, and my welt stays in place for measuring. So I don't usually use straight pins. If you put a pin, there's a hole in the hide and it will never go away. Unless you hit that hole again with a needle while you're sewing, it's going to create like a weak point possibly, or it might tear out the more like perforations you put in it. And just remember, like, whenever you put a hole through the hide, as it moves and as things pull on it and there's weight, that hole is going to get larger and larger as time goes by. So before I sew on the shoulder and the arm, I have these triangle pieces that create a little extra space so that the shoulder can articulate better. And you can see how thin this material is compared to the body of the tunic that we're applying it to, and that will create less bulk there. So I'm going to measure this and then pin it in place with the paper clips. I'll paper clip it in place rather. And then what that'll do is allow me to fit and measure the arm and make sure that it'll come together correctly before I sew down the rest of the tunic, because if some reason it's off, I'd rather have it be off down at the bottom where I can just trim a little bit and sculpt it, because that's already going to be cut as a natural V, versus trying to then retrim in this armpit, which is a very technical spot. So I tend to do like top down on the garment. So what I'm going to do is just very near the edge, I'm going to just kind of tack this in place with just a single loop and a knot, so that I can put it on and make sure that those triangles are in fact in the right spot. I should have marked on my pattern where I put the triangles, and in my head it makes sense where it's at, but I just want to really make sure that it's in the right spot. So the leather does act a little bit different than the cloth pattern, and so I'm just going to take the time to make sure, do 2 little tacks here, I'll do the same thing on the other side, put it on, make sure it fits so that the shoulder is correct on the body, and then add the sleeve. And the nice thing with this lower part of the tunic is that there is so much thickness to the leather that I'm less worried about holes, because it can withstand more. So yeah, that feels right. And then what I'll do is I'll try on my sleeve. I am going to move that triangle piece up to where it just matches that seam a little bit better. And I'll probably do it off center so there's not a bulk of 2 wefts coming and then folding them over twice. So I have my welt ready to go, so I'm going to put that on the seam. And I know that that's the corner where I'm going to be sewing the triangle on. And I'm putting my smoked sides together and lining that all up. I'm going to paper clip it in place. I don't mind having a little bit of extra welt on the end, and then I can go back with the loose nitch or the scissors later and trim it off. So get that nice and tight. doing the whip stitch. And this is where you just gotta take your time and have good thoughts and work through the hide. So I'm gonna be stitching just this line here along the edge of this triangle, and then I'll tie off, and then I'll sew the front onto this piece right here. So I am whip stitching on the sleeve to the shoulder, and I have the body of the tunic piece, and then I have a welt going through the middle of the seam, and then I have the sleeve piece here. And what I did to measure it and make sure it fit is I put the sleeve into the spot and then I kind of clipped it in place. I wanted my two ends to end up where this triangle piece of the armpit is. So I got it positioned correctly, and then I started sewing at the top and went down, and then now I'm going the other direction. So if I need to trim anything, I can make sure that they line up properly here. I spent about an hour and a half yesterday softening up this piece here of the body of the tunic because it was a little stiff. And I'll move my clip because I'm ready to do that. And so I use the stone scraper and the steel and the wire wheel. And then I have the bear grease kind of beeswax mixture. And I just oiled the seam a little bit where I was going to be sewing, and I did that last night so that the spot that I'm going to be working on can soften up a little bit more and be more flexible for bending because the shoulder's a part that needs a lot of movement. I can always go back later and soften this more, but once I put my thread in here, you can't really soften up the seam again. So it's important to make sure that your seams are as soft as you want them to be. If you don't have traditional oils of like animal fats, you can use things like olive oil or coconut oil. We use coconut oil all over the hide when we were down in Kenai to soften it and make it more lubricated and water resistant. The thing with coconut oil is it kind of sits on the top a little bit more, and the bear grease is one of the best oils for moose to actually penetrate into it. The one that works even better than bear grease, from what Helen and her grandmother used, is fermented fish head oil. And that goes even further into the leather faster. And it's a better penetrating oil as the animal fats than the plant-based fats. So I'm using a whip stitch, which is just going through all the material and then having the thread lay on top of the seam and then going over the top and going through the material again. So it's just kind of like lashing or wrapping the seam essentially. The nice thing about using a whip stitch is that it doesn't create bulk in the same way that using a running stitch would, because the seams kind of lay side by side rather than on top of each other. And that's nice for when you're working with thick material. And I'm trying to keep my stitches very even and not too close to the top because they rip out, and not too deep because then they show on the other side. And you want them consistent of how deep they are so that the seam looks straight. The other thing too is artificial sinew. It wants to slide, so I pull the stitches really tight each time because they're loosening up. Like the next three are a little bit looser, so when I pull each stitch, you're having to tighten as you go to get the like forced stitch that you did behind to actually be tight. Where when you use real sinew, it's been twisted, and that twist helps it grab a little bit better, so your stitches stay tighter, and you don't have to pull as hard each time to do the same thing. They kind of lock in place better. What needs to happen to complete the garment, and I'll work on it over the next few weeks, is I need to sew up the side here on both sides. I'm gonna put a welt in and then do a whip stitch like I've done up here, so it'll look very similar. I'll need to attach the other sleeve here to the shoulder and then sew up the side. And then the last steps will be the embellishment part, which will be putting fringe across the top here, and then also along this leading edge of the bottom, and then maybe some beadwork and dentalium or porcupine quill as well. Maybe a little bit of weaving in some sections or some quill wrapping. So those are the types of decisions that I'll make when I get to the embellishment stage. And I'm thinking wider fringe for the bottom that doesn't have any porcupine quill wrapping, and then narrower fringe for the top that might have some quill wrapping is probably what I'll end up doing. I want to think about the fringe that's going to go along this bottom edge here and how long I want it to be. Some of the historical pieces will have like 10-inch fringe, but I'm thinking I want something that's a little bit more modest or conservative as far as fringe, so maybe 3 inches that hangs down. So a fringe piece for the bottom will be attached with a whip stitch and a piece of welt in between. I want to make sure that it hangs correctly over the body. So it'll probably end up coming over the top here because there's more creasing that happens in the shoulder joint. So I want it to come a little higher, come across, and then scoop back up to the other side. So I just went and looked at the objects in collections and what it looks like for when the tunic piece, like I have here, if you're going to cut fringe into it, you're basically following in line, just making vertical cuts to the hide like this. So you're not doing an angle, you're trying to stay like in line with where the head is, and you're keeping them all parallel. So you're going to get fringe cut like that. And the cut marks are going like here, like this. If you have a piece that you'd be applying to the side, like that, and you were cutting it, that's where you'd have to do like the angle.
Yeah, because you'd be attaching a straight piece to an angle. So to make it straight, you'd actually have to draw it at an angle. Cut it at an angle, yeah.
For this piece, because of the size of the hide, I'm not going to be cutting directly into the tunic. So what I need to do is I'll cut a strip that's about this wide and make sure it matches nicely, and then get my angle correctly. So it'll be like that.
Mm-hmm.
And just make sure that I measure them correctly and they're all parallel. We're looking at the hide and trying to find a place to cut fringe. And the fringe is it needs to be really thin and really flexible. So the fringe comes from more of the belly section, and you can see how easily this folds and it can move and it's kind of bouncy. I made just a cloth sample for the width that it needs to be. I traced it on here, but I realized before I do that, I need to figure out the proper angle before I mark it and cut into the hide, because I might as well not waste a piece. So I'm gonna find the tip of the tunic and kind of line up the corner of the fabric. I've traced on about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I want to line that up to where my seam is good. And then I'm going to use that as the starting point for my angle, and draw my angle on here, cut that, and I'm going to transpose this. That will also be the same angle up top, to line it up with your tunic again and do a kind of visual check. So that's going to be my angle that I want to keep the whole time. And one of the things I could do as well is create like a cardboard or a wooden template like that to scribe lines onto, to make sure it's like a T-square where it's always the same. But now I have the pattern, so what I'm going to do is redraw my lines onto the hide. And I haven't worried about cutting off this fringe, or this undulating edge. I'm gonna cut it apart from the hide and then flatten it out and do it then. So now I'm ready to cut out the shape. I'm gonna put my pattern piece back on, and this just lays a little bit more relaxed than it did before. And I'm going to scribe the line here just to straighten it out. If I put this back to the hide, and what I want to do for the design element is have the fringe be a different color. So I'm going to use the unsmoked side for the fringe. And I'll use this piece as a piece of welt. So it's not like it's being wasted. It just needs to be squared up a little bit. I'll test it one last time, and that looks good. So now it's ready to have the lines measured and cut. So I drew the lines onto the smoked side, and I'm testing it on the reverse side because I want the light sides to be facing up. So I have all my lines. They look like they're running parallel and they'll hang straight, which is good. So now I would flip it over like that is the way that it would hang. And that's the side that I'm looking for, so I know that I put my marks on the correct side and that the lines are in fact in the right direction. So I'm going to use some scissors doing it, and when I'm using scissors, I'm making sure I don't stop and start in different places so there's not little hatch marks. Or you could use like a rotary wheel or a utility knife on a cutting board, Or what I'll sometimes do is take a utility knife and put it into a vise and then pull the hide through the razor. So you can see I've done 2. They hang pretty straight, and there's enough seam allowance on the top to where I can sew in the seam with a welt, and then the fringe will hang off the edge of the tunic nicely.